Hi, my name is Robert Janes, and I'm the lawyer for the Tumuk Treaty Association. I'm here today to talk to you about the agreement in principle that the chiefs and councils are considering and looking at approving sometime in the next few months. We know there's been a lot of discussion in the communities about the agreement in principle and think it's important to get out to as many of you as possible some information about what's in the agreement in principle. In a few weeks' time, we hope that the document will be released and will be publicly available. In the meantime, we hope you can use this video to inform yourself about what's in the agreement. And once the agreement's out, you can use this video to help you read the agreement. So what is an agreement in principle, and what is happening in the next few weeks? The agreement in principle is essentially the next step in the treaty process. It is a non-binding document. It doesn't change anybody's legal rights. It doesn't change the Douglas Treaties. It doesn't change the Indian Act. It doesn't change anything that you have now. But what it does is it signifies to all of the parties that we've reached enough of an agreement that we can move on to the next stage of negotiations. In the agreement, it makes it very clear that there are no legal consequences for any member of any of the Tumuk nations because of signing or approving the agreement in principle. It says that the agreement in principle is not binding. It says the agreement in principle does not change anybody's rights. And it also makes it clear that anything that's been said during negotiations is still confidential and can't be used in court. Even the agreement in principle can't be used in court against any Tumuk nation or against any of you. So then why is it that we're entering into this agreement in principle? Well, there's two main reasons. First, the governments of Canada and British Columbia will only engage in active treaty negotiations with a few First Nations at once. This is just a practical problem. The reality is there are only so many people in the government, only so many people dedicate to treaty negotiations, only so much time to do treaty negotiations. So the government focuses its efforts on those nations that look like they're serious about getting to final agreement and where significant progress has been made and where there seems to be some hope of actually getting to a final agreement. One of the important ways to signify this is by signing an agreement in principle which shows that we've reached agreement on some of the broad principles, even though this may change between final agreement and the agreement in principle. This step is particularly important for some of our nations. As you know, for Songhees and for Beecher Bay, there is a real shortage of land. In order to really put together a land package that will work for these nations, we need to get past agreement in principle so that federal land will come on the table and also so that the governments will allocate the money to be able to buy private land if necessary. As things stand right now, we all know that the land packages for Beecher Bay and Songhees are not acceptable. There really isn't enough land for economic development and there isn't enough land for community expansion. But we don't want to walk away from the treaty table because of that, because it is clear that there is land that is available. It's just a question of the governments taking the initiative to actually get that land available or to buy it from private parties who are willing to sell it. We won't be able to do that unless we get through agreement in principle. The second reason that we need to get through agreement in principle is that for most of the nations, we've signed interim treaty agreements. Those agreements, if you remember, give the nations land that they get to keep whether there's a treaty or not. The first half of the land for most of the nations, except for Beecher Bay, which got all of its land at first, was given in two parts. First, nations got one half of the land on signing the interim treaty agreement, and then when an agreement in principle is approved, the nations will get the second half of the land. For each of the nations, this land is a substantial piece of land with substantial value. And it is important that we get to that stage and get the land for the nations once and for all. So there is a real benefit to the nations for getting through agreement in principle so they get the full benefit of the interim treaty agreement. So how is the agreement in principle approved? When you do get to see the agreement in principle, you'll see that way down at the end of the table of contents, near chapter 26, there's a chapter called Approval of the Agreement in Principle. And this is the chapter that explains how the agreement in principle is approved. This is a relatively simple process. First, it has to be approved by the Government of Canada, then it has to be approved by the British Columbia government, and then it has to be approved by the First Nations governments. And the way that this works is that the negotiators will initial the agreement saying that it's ready to go to the governments. Then it needs to be approved by the federal cabinet, the provincial cabinet, and by the band councils. The band councils decide what kind of process they want to follow for approving the agreement in principle. There is no requirement that there be a referendum. The only time a referendum is required is when you get to a final agreement, when the community's rights can be actually affected. And as I'll explain later, the only way that the community's rights can finally be affected, the only way that a treaty can be approved, is if there is a vote in the communities and the communities approve the agreements. If the communities do not approve the agreements in a vote, there will be no final agreement. So the first chapter in the agreement principle is pretty self-explanatory. It's called definitions. The definitions chapter is essentially a long list of terms that are used in the agreement that explain what they mean, how they apply, and how they work. Most of these will be relatively uncomplicated. One thing that might not be clear is that the way that the definitions are written, it's designed in order to make it absolutely clear that at the end of the process, there will be, in fact, 5 different treaties. So when you read the agreement principle where it says Tumuk member First Nation, by the time we get to final agreement, there'll be a treaty for Songhees, there'll be a treaty for Beecher Bay, there'll be a treaty for Suk, there'll be a treaty for Malahat, and there'll be a treaty for Snanawas. And each will be a separate treaty at the end, and each nation will have its own vote. Other than that, the definitions are fairly self-explanatory and are used through the rest of the agreement. The next chapter is called General Provisions. This is a very important chapter in the treaty. It is the chapter that sets out the nature of the treaty, describes the relationship between the First Nation and the 2 governments, describes the status of the rights under our Constitution, and also describes how relations will work with other First Nations after the treaty is signed. So here are the important parts of the agreement. First, the General Provisions chapter makes it clear that the treaty lives within the Constitution of Canada. So in case anybody in the communities are worried that signing a treaty will mean that you'll lose your rights as a citizen of Canada, that there'll be ability of anybody to discriminate against you or to interfere with your freedom of expression or any of your other freedoms that are guaranteed in the treaty, don't worry. The treaty makes it clear that the human rights of all Tumuk people are protected and that the treaty works within the Constitution of Canada. The second thing that the General Provisions chapter makes clear is that after the treaty is signed and comes into effect, that except for one provision, which keeps track of which people have status, the Indian Act no longer applies. The reserves will be under your control. The Indian Act will no longer be there to determine how your lands can be used, how your family relations are dealt with, how your property is dealt with. Instead, you'll move out of the Indian Act and into the system set up under the treaty and under your own constitutions. The next major piece of the General Provisions chapter deals with how the treaty affects other people. And one thing that it makes crystal clear, and this is important in case any of your relatives in other communities are raising concerns about the treaty, is that nothing in the treaty will affect the rights of other Aboriginal people. So if there are other Aboriginal rights or other treaty rights out there, there is nothing that this treaty does to take away those rights, to affect those rights, to harm those rights. In fact, the treaty says that if it turns out that there is a real conflict between the rights in the treaty, your treaty, and the rights of some other First Nation, the other First Nation's rights come out on top, and what will happen is that the government will then have to find some way to fix the problem that's been created so that you end up back in the position that you should have been. So when you are talking to your relatives in other communities, you can assure them that the treaty is designed to protect their rights. Now, the next major part of the treaty deals with the whole question of certainty. Now, certainty is something that there's a lot of interest in the First Nations, and it's the thing that deals with the question of what happens to the rights we have already, and also how do we know that the government will actually respect the rights that we're given. So the overall package works this way. First of all, this treaty makes it clear that this is not like the old-fashioned treaties, such as the numbered treaties or even the Douglas treaties, in that there is nothing in the treaty that says that your rights are extinguished, that your rights are ceded, that your rights are surrendered. In fact, it makes it very clear that your rights are not surrendered, ceded, or extinguished. Next, what it does do is it says that to the extent that any of your rights that you have now are different than the rights that you have set out in the treaty, those rights will continue, but will be modified so that they will match up with the rights that are in the treaty. This is the method that was used in the Nishka Agreement to ensure that the rights match up. This may mean that the rights get larger, or it may mean that the rights get adjusted to be smaller in some ways. It also means that any of the new rights that are promised in the treaties that may not be in the Douglas Treaties or may not be Aboriginal rights are guaranteed to you. They get the same constitutional protection that other treaty rights get. Now, I do have to say something about this. The modification approach, which the Nishka developed, there are many First Nations that don't like that, and we've expressed concerns about it as well. So there is another approach that's being developed. Tumuk is involved along with other First Nations in working with the federal government and the provincial government to try to implement a new approach to certainty. But that approach is not ready yet, and so we've all agreed that for the time being we'll work with the model that's out there now, with the approach that's out there now, but we've also agreed that we will discuss and negotiate the new model if, in fact, we reach an agreement that that's acceptable to be used. The next important part of the General Provisions chapter is that it does also make it clear that, that the treaty is, is in fact a priority law in Canada. What it says is that, except for the Constitution, that if the treaty conflicts with a federal law or a provincial law, then the treaty prevails. So we are given an express promise laid out in black and white that if the federal or provincial laws conflict with the treaty, then the treaty comes out on top. Essentially, the way that things work is that the government and the First Nations agree to a set of rules that say how federal and provincial laws will work together. Sometimes it says that the Tumuk laws come out on top. Sometimes it says that federal and provincial laws come out on top. But there's an agreed upon process, there are agreed upon rules, and the governments have to comply with those rules. There are a few other sections in the General Provisions chapter, but for the most part, these do not interest anybody other than really lawyers, and I won't really take you through those in detail. But many of those are designed to make sure that all of the main promises that are made in the treaty actually are effective. They're designed to make sure that the government acts in good faith, and they're designed to make sure that, that when the treaty is interpreted in the future, it's given a useful, practical interpretation. Before leaving General Provisions, I want to talk just for a moment about the fisheries issue, because I know that many of you worry about fisheries and worry about what's happening to the fisheries. What we've agreed in the agreement principle is that for now, the fisheries issue is completely untouched. So as matters stand right now, there are no promises made about new fishing rights, and there are promises made in General Provisions and in other places in the treaty that the fishing rights you have now are not affected. This includes the Douglas Treaty fishing rights, which continue as they were before. The next chapter is eligibility and enrollment. This is a chapter that describes, first of all, who are the people who have to be included in your community for the purposes of voting and citizenship, and also deals with the process for getting people onto the list, ultimately for the purposes of voting at the time of the referendum, and also for participating in your community in the future. There are a couple of basic principles in the eligibility enrollment chapter. First, the chapter says anybody who is on your ban list today is entitled to be enrolled as a member. So nobody can lose the status that they have right now because they're a band member. Secondly, the agreement says that a person who has an ancestral connection to your community, has maintained a close connection to your community, and identifies as a member of your community is also eligible to be enrolled. This is designed to make sure that people who, for one reason or another, because of the effect of the Indian Act in the past, have been cut off from your community, aren't completely cut out of the future treaty if they've maintained a real connection to your community. On the other hand, it strikes a balance in making sure that there's not a lot of strangers brought into your community by insisting upon the fact that it's only people who've maintained a connection to your community who are entitled to be enrolled. The question of who has maintained a close connection is something that a committee appointed in your community, something called the Enrollment Committee, will determine. And there's a list of factors set out. And the factors are common sense factors, such as how many ancestors they have, how close the ancestors they have are, where they live, where they were born, what kind of participation they had in the community. They're really a list of common sense factors that are designed to make sure that people who have maintained a real connection to your community are included. And then all people who are descended from those two categories of people are entitled to be enrolled, so that in the future there's no cutoff because of issues around marrying in or marrying out. Your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on through the generations will be entitled to be included. The other thing that the treaty provides is that adoption does not cut anybody off from their rights if they're adopted out of the community, and likewise if they're adopted into the community and into a family, that they're treated just like ordinary natural children. So adopted children are given a very fair treatment and are treated in a way that makes sure that any kids who over the years may have been taken out of your community involuntarily are given a chance to enroll if they want to. There are also provisions in here to make sure that people don't sign up in two treaties at once, particularly two modern treaties. There's an exception in that for the Douglas treaties, because obviously many people in the communities have rights in multiple Douglas treaty groups. But if you belong to Treaty 8 or to the Nishka Agreement, if you want to enroll in one of your modern treaties, then you have to make a choice about which treaty you belong to. The remainder of the eligibility enrollment chapter describes the process for enrolling, and it involves the establishment of a committee in your community that will be in charge of running the enrollment process. There's various guarantees about that process being fair and open, and then if there's unhappiness about a result that comes out of that committee, there has to be an appeal board that will deal with appeals. And finally, anybody who feels that there's been an illegal act or some profound unfairness will have the right to actually go to the courts to deal with these matters. So the next chapter is Treaty Settlement Land. So the title of this chapter is very specific. It focuses on the land that will actually be transferred to the First Nation or given control to the First Nation as what is called Treaty Settlement Land. We've made sure that this chapter is not just called the land chapter, as we want to ensure that everybody understands that the treaty is a lot more than just the pieces of land that are transferred to you. As I'll be discussing later, there are extensive rights to hunt, gather, fish, we hope, to participate in environmental assessment processes, to participate in the protecting of culture and heritage off Treaty Settlement Land, to work in parks. All of these things will be happening off Treaty Settlement Land. Treaty Settlement Land is not the whole package, it's part of the package. But of course, it's a very important part of the package. And I want to describe to you now what is in the Treaty Settlement Land chapter. So the first part of the Treaty Settlement Land chapter just describes what the lands are, and essentially what it says is that there's going to be a map, and the land shown on those maps, there's going to be one map for each nation, will in fact be the treaty settlement land for that nation. That is, if it's inside the map, regardless of who owns it, it is treaty settlement land. If it's outside the map, then it's not treaty settlement land. Second, the next important part of the Treaty Settlement Land chapter describes how the First Nation owns the land and what ownership rights the First Nation has. And the basic rule is that the First Nation gets what I call fee simple plus. So fee simple is the legal type of ownership that's recognized in Western or English law, which is the highest possible form of ownership. It's really complete control of land. And the reason it's fee simple plus is that ordinary fee simple land, so land that would be owned off the reserves or off treaty settlement land, land that somebody like me might own in my home community, has a few things that are taken out of it and held back for the government. For example, mineral rights. Another example would be the right of the government to take back a certain amount of the land without compensating me for various purposes. In the case of your lands, in case of treaty settlement lands, the government has agreed that those exceptions will be taken out so that what you will get will be complete ownership. Now, some of you may ask, well, what does that mean about the land that I have now? What about my CP? What about the land that's held by my tenants? What about the right-of-ways that go through the reserves? The agreement that we've reached is that all of those things will be in some way or another continued so that nobody will lose what they have now. Either the rights will be continued as they were, or there'll be a replacement issued which will give them at least what they had before. So that the CP holders will get a land holding that's like CP's, leaseholders will get lease holdings that at least give them what they had before, and the right-of-ways that are necessary to get services and utilities onto your lands will still continue. But in order to avoid confusion, what's been agreed is that between the agreement in principle and final agreement, the governments and the First Nations, and this will involve the communities as well, will work together to develop a list of all of those matters. Those will be attached to the treaty, and anything that's in those lists will be continued, and anything not on those lists will come to an end. So there'll be no hidden interests, no hidden claims in the future. If it turns out that somebody is affected by this because something wasn't continued, then it's going to be the responsibility of the federal government or provincial government to compensate them or make it right with them. It won't be the responsibility of your communities. The other thing that the First Nation will get that ordinary fee simple owners don't get will be the mineral rights under their land. So people who have mineral rights now will keep them, but the crown mineral rights, so mineral rights that haven't been staked or claimed by somebody else, will be transferred to the First Nations. In this area, probably the most important right will be gravel rights. Gravel is a major resource in this area, and those rights, subject to whatever interest the government has now, will in fact be transferred over to the First Nation, and the First Nation can use them to their benefit. Now, what about into the future? Well, one of the great things about treaty settlement land is that unlike reserve land, since you are an owner, you are able to transfer or sell or lease or rent the land directly to other people. So you will be able to move on and start doing economic development on a basis similar to the basis that ordinary people can do it, ordinary companies can do it, and start actually getting some benefit out of your land. You don't have to have your land frozen while we wait for the government to think about whether or not to let your community lease land for economic development, or to rent land out for economic development, or possibly even to sell land for economic development, in which case it would have come out of your reserves. Under the treaty settlement land system, your government, together with your people, can decide, for example, to sell land to other people, and it will still be treaty settlement land. This will mean that that land will still be under your governance system. It means that that land will still be subject to your nation's taxation system. It means that that land will still be subject to whatever protections there are in the treaty for treaty settlement land. So there is a system put in place that maximizes the ability of the First Nations to conveniently use their lands for economic development or for residential purposes, or to give your members ownership of land, while still protecting the First Nations' rights to govern the land. The Treaty Settlement Land chapter also contains chapters or sections dealing with governance powers, so the power to zone land, to control nuisances, to expropriate land if necessary for public purposes, to control how the land that's controlled by the First Nation government is sold or leased. And all of these powers are designed to make sure that the First Nations' ability to exercise real governance powers over its land is protected. Now, there are some downsides to the Treaty Settlement Land chapter. First of all, the government still insists upon having the power to expropriate when necessary. However, compared to the Indian Act, which also allows expropriation, the expropriation sections that have been included in the Treaty Settlement Land chapter have a number of protections that are designed to make it very difficult for the government to expropriate, and to make sure that if they do decide to expropriate, it's only if strictly necessary and only to the extent that it's actually necessary to do so. It also makes sure that there is fair compensation paid, even if an ordinary person wouldn't be entitled to fair compensation. Also, if land is expropriated from the First Nation government, there are provisions that allow for replacement land to be given to the First Nation. So all of this is designed to maximize the chance that the First Nation will not be subject to expropriation, and if it is subject to expropriation, there will be fair compensation for everyone affected by the expropriation. Additionally, the provincial government has indicated, given the small amount of land that's being considered, that they will entertain the possibility of a cap on the total amount of expropriation available. Finally, there are several sections in the Treaty Settlement Lands chapter that deal with how to acquire future land. Many of these sections remain to be negotiated and largely suggest that between agreement in principle and final agreement, lists of land will be identified, which will be included in the treaty settlement land if certain circumstances arise. So that means we'll be able to acquire certain federal land, acquire certain provincial land, or if we're able to acquire certain private land, we can just add it to treaty settlement land. And there's a general agreement that if everybody agrees, provincial government, federal government, and local governments, then almost any land that is acquired can be added to treaty settlement land. So that's an overview of the treaty settlement land chapter. One last thing to understand about the treaty settlement land once you enter into treaty is that it will no longer be federal land for any purposes. This reflects the fact that the land is being transferred to your control and will be subject to the treaty rather than to the control of the federal government. The next chapter is the access chapter. The access chapter deals with when people may come on to treaty settlement land, and the basic principles are pretty simple. First, it says that some lands may be designated over time as private lands, in which case there are no rights of access unless the First Nation or somebody living on your land invites people on. There'll be other lands that will be called public lands, which ordinary people will have the right to access, provided they do no damage to the land, engage in no harvesting. So they're allowed to pass over the land, essentially. An important part of the access chapter is that the First Nation will be protected from liability in the event that somebody breaks their leg or falls and hurts themselves on your land while they're using the access rights. Another part of the access chapter deals with the rights of the governments to access your land and your governments to access Crown land if necessary. And essentially there are provisions that allow for the governments to access land in the case of delivering services or dealing with emergencies. Additionally, there are provisions in there dealing with how utility companies such as TELUS, Shaw, companies like that may be delivering services to people on the reserve can enter the land and actually provide these services without having to enter into long, extended legal negotiations. The next chapter is the off-treaty settlements land chapter. This chapter has a relatively limited value. It's essentially a chapter that provides that if the provincial government engages in any large-scale planning processes in southern Vancouver Island or in your territory, you will have the right to participate in those processes. This is a useful promise in some places, but as a practical matter, it's unlikely that the provincial government will be engaging in any large-scale planning processes on southern Vancouver Island. For the most part, these matters are handled by local governments. The next chapter is called Crown Roads and Corridors. Essentially, this chapter deals with the problem of who owns the roads and how will the roads be managed. And the basic approach is this, that as a part of the treaty negotiation, roads will be identified, surveyed, plans will be attached to the treaty for those roads, and those roads will be taken out of the treaty settlement land. So they will not count against you for the purposes of calculating how much benefit you've gotten, and they will remain in Crown control. This will not apply to the private roads that exist on your treaty settlement land or exist on your reserves now. This is primarily focused on the major Crown roads and potentially major Crown corridors like the E&N Railway, if that's still operating when the time of the treaty negotiations complete. What goes along with this are certain rights to maintain the Crown roads and corridors, and additionally there are provisions in there that deal with the possibility that over time roads may be realigned or roads may close, and in which case there are provisions that allow for the land to be returned to the First Nation or added on to the First Nations treaty settlement land. The next chapter is environmental assessment and environmental protection. This chapter deals with a number of different topics. First, environmental assessment describes the processes that are used by the federal and provincial government, and potentially by your government, to assess the effects of major projects. This is something that will likely have relatively little application in your territory, since there are not that many major projects like mines that are likely to be undertaken in the southern Vancouver Island area, at least in the vicinity of your treaty settlement land. However, if a process is undertaken, you will have certain clear rights to participate in those processes, participate in the panel, suggest how the process should be carried out, and to make sure your views are known if there's any possibility that your rights may be negatively affected or your lands may be negatively affected. Additionally, there are provisions that in this chapter that deal with the continuation of environmental protection, that environmental protection laws will continue and will apply to your lands. You'll be able to take advantage of those laws and will also be subject to those laws. Additionally, your First Nation government will have certain obligations to have systems in place in case of environmental emergencies. Finally, there are two large sections that remain to be negotiated between agreement in principle and final agreement. First of all, there is an agreement that there will be a discussion about how smaller projects will be dealt with. Under the old environmental assessment legislation, or at least the federal legislation, smaller projects were assessed even if those assessments were relatively quick and light. Unfortunately, the laws were changed so that those small projects are no longer assessed. And so there's a gap now in the federal law. And in the treaty, we have a provision that essentially says there's going to be a discussion about how that gap will be dealt with, where a smaller project may affect your land. Second, there are substantial areas off treaty settlement land where we believe that the First Nation has a real interest in seeing positive environmental steps being taken to either protect those areas or alternatively improve those areas. So, for example, the Souk Basin and Souk Harbor desperately need to be cleaned up, and that's going to involve the coordination of several governments, likely positive action by those governments, and real plans to make sure that that water body returns to a healthy state for shellfish harvesting, for human use, and for fisheries. One of the agreements that we have in the AIP is that between final agreement and principle, we'll identify those areas. We will then negotiate measures to be put in place for those areas, which may be as simple as just clearly stated protection measures that will have to be implemented, or maybe more elaborate, involving processes involving the governments to actually positively remediate those lands over time. The next chapter is the forest resources chapter. This chapter is of greater significance in areas such as the Nisga'a Agreement, where there are very large areas of forest land that have to be managed. In the case of your lands, which are relatively small and where the forests are relatively limited on your treaty settlement lands, the forest resources chapter is relatively straightforward. Essentially, it provides that your land will be treated like private land for the purposes of managing forest resources, which is a very favorable treatment. And additionally, there's an agreement that for the purposes of export or processing, your lands will be given what amounts to really the most positive treatment available. There are also provisions in the forest resources chapter that involve the governments having discussions about how to coordinate forestry activities off TSL and on TSL, so that the activities that are done on either don't affect the other. And finally, there will be a discussion between AIP and final about how forest fires will be managed and paid for if forest fires occur, and additionally how measures to ensure forest health are dealt with. The next chapter is the wildlife chapter. This is obviously of great interest to all members of the Tumuk community, given that it relates to the activities of hunting, both in Douglas Treaty traditional territory and elsewhere in the province. Essentially, there is a promise that there will be a right to harvest wildlife that is promised to the First Nation, and that right can be exercised by any citizen of the First Nation. Additionally, there are provisions that say that where a citizen for some reason is unable to hunt, such as they're elderly or sick, measures can be taken to authorize close family members to hunt for them, even if those family members are not part of the community. Harvesting will be subject to safety and public health concerns, and will also be subject to conservation measures, as is the case now. Additionally, the First Nation is given lawmaking power with respect to the treaty rights, and that means that there will be powers to pass laws controlling how the treaty rights are exercised, who can exercise the treaty rights, and to generally ensure that the First Nation citizens comply with any conservation measures or public health and safety measures. The treaty rights will be exercised in an area that's defined on a map. That map has yet to be negotiated, and there's obviously a large disagreement between the government and us as to how big that map will be. But even outside that area, there are provisions in the wildlife chapter that allow for hunting, provided that there is the proper consent obtained from the First Nation in whose territory you propose to hunt. Exactly how those sections will work is a matter that's being developed and will be negotiated between agreement in principle and final agreement. In addition to the sections that promise you a hunting right, there are also sections that deal with what controls are put on the government in terms of limiting the hunting right. So if the government wants to propose a conservation measure that may be necessary, there is a process that has to be followed to ensure that the conservation measure is really necessary, that the conservation measure interferes with your rights as little as possible. And if the conservation measure goes as far as actually limiting the number of animals you can harvest, how the allocation is determined is a matter that can actually be sent to arbitration to be determined. Overall, the treaty provides a clearer process for the government imposing conservation measures in a way that respects the treaty rights and actually ensures that measures are only being imposed for conservation reasons and not for other reasons unrelated to conservation. The wildlife chapter will also allow First Nation members to trade and barter wildlife with other First Nations people. So exchanges, for example, could happen for fish or for access. However, sale will not be permitted unless it's otherwise permitted under federal and provincial law. There is, however, protection for First Nation people or for Tumuk citizens who are traveling with game that they've harvested pursuant to the treaty. It makes it very clear that they are legally able to transport their game. The next chapter is the migratory birds chapter. The migratory birds chapter deals with harvesting migratory birds. This is normally a federal responsibility, so it's dealt with in a separate chapter. It is very much like the wildlife chapter in that there is a promise of a harvesting right, which allows you to harvest migratory birds in an area that's to be negotiated. There are also sections dealing with the ability of the government to impose conservation measures, but again, there's a process for ensuring that there's genuine consultation before those measures are imposed, and also that the measures interfere with your rights as little as possible. The same rules will apply with respect to trade and barter. There's a promise that transportation will be legal and sale will not be legal unless it's otherwise permitted under provincial or federal law. Finally, for both the wildlife chapter and the migratory birds chapter, there is an obligation that First Nation citizens who are harvesting carry some form of documentation issued by the First Nation, not by the government, but by the First Nation, to ensure that they're actually entitled to harvest. What we hope is that this will take the form of a card that will serve as essentially an identity card and will indicate the person's right to harvest. The next chapter is the shortest chapter as it stands right now, which is the fisheries chapter. Essentially, the fisheries chapter says that the parties agree that fisheries are unchanged at this time and that it will have to be a future negotiation as to whether or not there will be a fisheries chapter in the final agreement. Realistically, we expect that there will be a fisheries chapter in the final agreement, but there are substantial negotiations that will have to happen between now and then to see if we can reach an agreement that is satisfactory to everybody on the fisheries issue. The next chapter is the water chapter. The water chapter primarily deals with the ability to access either streams or groundwater. The core promise that's made in the water chapter is that the First Nations will be assigned what are called water reservations, that is, a protected volume of water, which they will be able to access from various creeks and streams that are going to be listed in the agreement. These water reservations will be given priority over any other water reservations or water licenses that may be issued after a certain date. The First Nation government will then be able to license water so that various people in the community can use the water. Additionally, if there's a groundwater regime introduced, there'll be similar arrangements negotiated for groundwater, and that may become a very significant issue in the near future as the province is changing the Water Act to introduce a groundwater regime. As a practical matter, this is a chapter that primarily will affect Malahat and potentially Nanoose and possibly Souk. In the case of Beecher Bay and Songhees, it's expected that most of the water supply will come from the urban water supply provided by the CRD. In the case of Souk, some of the treaty settlement lands will need to have a water supply obtained locally, and the water chapter may help in that regard. Malahat and Nanoose are dependent upon groundwater or water licenses at present, and we expect this will continue. So these two nations will have to focus very intently on how the water chapter works, and at the very least ensure that the reservations and licenses arranged will protect the existing water supply. We are hopeful, however, that it will provide a meaningful water supply that will allow community expansion and economic development in the future. So the next chapter is the governance chapter, and this is the chapter that deals with the right of self-government on your treaty settlement lands and over your own citizens. This is a very lengthy chapter and quite a complicated chapter. However, there are a couple of important pieces. First, the treaty makes it absolutely clear that your nations have the right to self-government, and that right will be protected in the treaty. For some time, the provincial government was saying that they wanted to see self-government protected outside of the treaty so that if they changed their views down the road, they could draw it back or unilaterally change it. But it became very clear that there was going to be no agreement in the treaty if they insisted on this. And so there is now a clear guarantee that self-government will be protected in the treaty. Each First Nation is going to have a government. It's going to have public institutions if it chooses to set them up, and that it will act collectively through its government. Additionally, each First Nation is going to have a constitution. That constitution is going to be developed on a nation-by-nation basis between AIP and final, and will have to be approved in a referendum by the community. There's a list of matters that have to be dealt with in your constitution, but some of the most important ones are that the Constitution has to be a democratic constitution. It has to provide for regular elections. It has to provide for accountability of your government to your citizens. There has to be provisions for fiscal transparency with the information being made available to your community, and various other provisions related to how your government works. Additionally, there will also have to be a citizenship code which will spell out who you entitle to be a citizen in your community. One of the basic rules is that everybody who's eligible under the eligibility chapter has to have the right to become a citizen if they choose to, but you may choose to make your citizenship larger and include more people for various reasons if you want to. This will be something that you will decide yourself and will form at least part of your constitution, and may also be reflected in the citizenship code outside of your constitution. This will be a very important piece of work between agreement in principle and final agreement. For some of the nations, some of that work has already been done as a part of developing land code, but there is a lot more work that will have to be done even for those nations. The next part of the governance chapter deals with essentially the government acting fairly in the way that it affects people. So it's expected that after agreement principle, after final agreement, rather, there will be people who are citizens living on your treaty settlement land. There will be people who are not citizens living on your treaty settlement land. And your government may make decisions that could affect them. So there are basic rules built into the governance chapter to ensure fairness for the people living on your land. Notice will have to be given of any decisions that are made. people will have to have a chance to let the government know how those decisions may affect them, and the government has to take that into account. Additionally, if the government sets up public institutions, so like a school board, for example, which has powers that could affect non-citizens, non-citizens have the right, if they're living on treaty settlement land, to select by election or some other method at least one person to sit on that public institution. However, there is no right on the part of non-citizens to appoint somebody to your government or to elect somebody from your government or to vote for your government. Your government will be elected solely by your citizens. Now, after this, there's a section that deals with protections for your government officials, ensure that they are not open to unfair or unjust attacks for carrying out their government duties. And this is actually an improvement on the situation now, where councillors and chiefs are given no real protections in the way that even mayors or members of the provincial legislature are given. After those sections, there is a long list of governance powers that are laid out for the First Nations governments. I won't try to list them all in this discussion, but they include matters such as the power to set laws involving how marriages will be carried out, how adoptions will be carried out. There are various laws involving child and family welfare services. There's laws involving the management of structures on your land. There's a long list of laws that are designed to essentially ensure that your First Nation is able to make laws that protect your lands, enhance economic development, and also serve your people. These laws are written in a way that spell out, first of all, what the scope of the lawmaking power is, so what the government can do, but it also lays out what happens in the case that there's a conflict between your law and a federal or provincial law. In some cases, your law is the law that comes out on top in the case of a conflict. In some cases, it's federal or provincial law. Fundamentally, though, for matters that relate to your lands or to your people, it is your laws that usually predominate. There are also provisions in the final agreement that deal with, in the governance chapter of the final agreement, that deal with matters such as the right to challenge new laws, to challenge decisions that are made. There are rights to have decisions reviewed so that the government can be held to account either within your own tribunals or in court. There are also provisions that deal with the ability to enforce your laws in the courts, which involves making agreements between your government and the other governments so that it's clear who can prosecute those people and who can and who's responsible for the costs associated with that. It's important to understand that the governance chapter provides the power to make laws, but does not require any government to make laws. One thing that's a very practical reality for each of your First Nations is that you're relatively small and that it will take time to develop your economic base. It'll also take time to ensure that your systems of government are working properly. So just because there are law-making powers, it shouldn't be expected that your First Nation will exercise those law-making powers right away. Instead, it is likely that there will be periods of time where important laws will be passed first. The government will take time to make sure that the systems are up and running. And then as new laws are necessary, say, for example, to protect culture or to provide for education on treaty settlement land, those laws will be introduced. The next chapter is called Local Government Relations, and this deals with the relationship between your lands and government and the local governments, that is, the regional districts and cities in your area. The starting point is that unless you choose otherwise, you are outside of the regional districts, you are outside of the local municipalities, and you are outside of any electoral areas. The advantage of this is that you are free from any control by those local governments. The disadvantage of this is that it means that you may not be able to get some of the services that they provide. Under the local government chapter, you will have the ability to opt into joining regional districts. This is provided for in the Local Government Act, and it's something that each First Nation is going to have to consider as it gets ready for treaty. There are advantages and there are disadvantages to entering into the regional districts. There will be certain costs that will be undertaken, but also it means that there will be certain powers that you obtain, and it will also ensure the delivery of certain kinds of services. If you don't opt into the regional district, there are also powers in the final agreement that allow for the negotiation of service agreements, so that just as now services are often provided on treaty settlement land by agreement, you will be able to arrange the same after the final agreement. Thus, for example, there can be agreements covering fire service, ambulance service, emergency numbers, water services, sewage services, all the things that will make it possible to use your land into the future. The discussion of whether or not to join the regional district will be different for each First Nation and will be happening between AIP and final agreement, and likely even after final agreement. In addition to those provisions, there are some very specific provisions dealing with having to participate in the Regional Hospital Board. Essentially, First Nations are required to participate in the Regional Hospital Board, and there will be a negotiation about how the costs associated with that will be dealt with. While the local government chapter is a relatively short chapter and really deals with matters that are outside the treaty, as a practical matter, the negotiations with the local governments will be an important part of deciding whether or not the treaty settlement land and the overall treaty package is acceptable. It will be important to ensure that you have services and access to services before you accept the treaty, as it's going to be hard to do economic development without access to modern urban services. The next chapter is culture and heritage. This is a chapter that largely deals with physical heritage, such as artifacts and remains, and the First Nations' interests in those. The chapter is divided up into different topics. First, it deals with control of culture and heritage on treaty settlement land. And essentially, the system is designed to give the First Nation a very high level of control over treaty settlement land and culture and heritage on treaty settlement land, unless for some reason there is a police investigation or a coroner's investigation, for example, if human remains are found. Thus, if human remains are found or an artifact is found on treaty settlement land, unless it can be shown that it actually belongs to somebody else, so there's a clear claimant or family who has a connection to it, it will be the First Nation government that will determine the degree to which those remains can be disturbed, how those remains will be managed, how those artifacts will be managed, and they can make laws to deal with those matters. The next thing that the chapter deals with is the return of artifacts, first from the Museum of Civilization, as it used to be called. It's now, I think, the Museum of History. That's the Federal Museum in Ottawa, and the return of artifacts from the Royal BC Museum. And essentially what the agreement contemplates is that between agreement in principle and final, there will be a negotiation about any artifacts that are identified as belonging to a First Nation or a First Nations person who comes from one of your First Nations. And a determination will be made whether that artifact should be returned to the community or remain at the BC Museum or remain at the Museum of Civilization. There are not a lot of artifacts that are listed as belonging to your communities. There are many Salish artifacts which came from other Salish communities, but there are some. And the question for each community will be the degree to which they want to negotiate having those artifacts brought back and proper facilities built to store them, which can be quite expensive, or alternatively entering into arrangements with, for example, the BC Museum to be able to access those articles. The next major section deals with place naming, and there's an agreement that the First Nations and British Columbia can negotiate new place names for locations in southern Vancouver Island or within the traditional territories of the First Nation. Those negotiations need to get started soon, and there's a real opportunity here to rename or possibly name for the first time important locations using your names for those locations. The final section deals with off-treaty settlement land culture and heritage, so remains or artifacts found off treaty settlement land, which are presently governed by the Heritage Conservation Act. And essentially what the agreement is that there's a recognition that the First Nations will have a continued interest in those artifacts and those remains, and that between agreement in principle and final, there will be a further negotiation about how that interest will be dealt with. The next two chapters deal with harvesting in federal and provincial parks. Essentially, the approach that's taken in the treaty is that those areas are dealt with completely separately from other areas, and in essence are quite simply dealt with. First of all, there is a promise that there is a right to harvest in those areas, although how that right is managed will have to be negotiated between the First Nations and the relevant parks administration. Secondly, there's agreements that there will be consultation around matters such as opening a new park, closing a park, or changing the boundaries of a park. Sometimes there are possibilities of economic opportunities or possibly cultural interests in parks, and the treaty contemplates that there will be a negotiation of what will be called a collaborative management agreement between the Parks Administration and the First Nation, which will allow for First Nation participation in economic opportunities, which will allow for measures to be negotiated for management of cultural artifacts, or for example, protection of burials, or proper naming or description of important cultural sites, and a wide range of other matters. Largely, the section approaches the matter as a negotiation between the First Nations government and the parks management. Ultimately, the Parks chapter is designed to create a balance between the First Nations' interests in harvesting in parks, protecting cultural interests in parks on one side, and the parks' interest in maintaining the parks as protected ecological areas on the other side. It is important to note that these chapters only deal with federal and provincial parks and do not deal with regional district parks such as East Souk Park. The treaty views matters such as East Souk Park or the other regional district parks or municipal parks such as Beacon Hill Park as being issues between the First Nations and the local governments, and so these would be dealt with under the local government chapter or by separate agreements. The next chapter is the gathering chapter. This is a chapter that deals with the gathering of plants, including medicinal plants, and the approach is similar to that as found in the wildlife and migratory birds chapter. Essentially, there will be an area described where the First Nations citizens will have a right to harvest plants subject to concerns about public health and safety or conservation. There is a process for dealing with conservation measures where the government will be required to consult and, if necessary, ensure that the effects are minimized. This will be an important part of the treaty and is one that we expect will work quite well. Additionally, there are provisions in the agreement in principle that provide for negotiation for the harvesting of actual standing timber for ceremonial purposes or for domestic purposes, such as, for example, building a totem pole or a longhouse or a house pole. These are matters that will have to be fleshed out between agreement in principle and final agreement. So the next chapters deal more with financial matters and with procedural matters, but they're quite important. The next major chapter in the treaty is what's called the capital transfer and loan repayment chapter. So this is the chapter that deals with how will the money be transferred from the government to the First Nation and how will the loan be dealt with. As you all know, there's been borrowing over the years, and the position that we've always taken is that enough money has to be provided to more than cancel out the loan and leave the First Nation with an adequate economic base to start off with. So essentially the treaty at present provides that there will be a payment over several years of the capital transfer, so that's the money that's being given to the First Nation. And additionally, then at the same time, there will be amounts deducted to pay off the loan over time. We expect that by the time the final agreement is negotiated, there will just be a single payment which will take care of both the capital transfer and the loan. What we fully expect, to be really clear, is that enough will be added to the treaty in one way or another to make sure that the loan is taken care of. In addition to the ordinary capital transfer, there are provisions in the agreement in principle for the creation of a land fund. This is money that will be available between agreement in principle and final agreement to acquire new lands that can be added to the treaty settlement land package. So if new Crown land is found, it will be valued and the amount will be taken off the capital transfer, or alternatively, if there are private lands that are bought, they will be acquired and will be added to taken off the land fund. And additionally, there will be provisions that essentially ensure that if the capital transfer is paid out over time, there'll be protection given for for inflation. The next chapter is called Fiscal Relations. This is the chapter that deals with how will programs and funding for your government be dealt with. One basic commitment in the treaty, which everybody in your community should be aware of, is that the federal government and the provincial government and the First Nation governments have agreed that any program or service that is available to ordinary Indians who are not part of the treaty will also be available to ordinary Indians who are part of the treaty. So programs such as the supplemental health program, the dental program, the post-secondary education program will all continue to be funded by the federal government and will all continue to be available to ordinary First Nations persons if they're Indians. Now, of course, if the government changes their approach for other Indians, then they may also change their approach for you, but this has nothing to do with the treaty. So I want to assure you that when we look at the fiscal relations chapter, the basic rule is that your programs and services will continue as before. The way that the fiscal relations chapter is expected to work is that there will be an outside of treaty agreement negotiated that will carry on from time to time, where the federal government will provide funding to the First Nations government to deliver services that are defined in the agreement. The federal government is presently reviewing its approach and may be moving towards a formula-based approach, which will give them more certainty and potentially protect the First Nation more from unexpected changes in social circumstances. However, we have to watch this very carefully, as the means by which this is implemented may have profound effects on the First Nations. But this chapter is designed to make sure that the First Nations government is properly funded. One thing we do anticipate is that over time, the First Nation will have to, as it generates its own revenue, make contributions towards those programs and services. This is referred to as own source revenue, and it is a matter of intense controversy and debate. But until we move into the final agreement negotiations, we will really not know the details of how this is expected to work. But the fundamental rule is that your services will be protected and that the First Nations will be funded to deliver those services. The next section is the taxation chapter. So this chapter really deals with three major issues. First of all, the power of the First Nation to tax. And there are two essential powers. One is a power in the treaty to actually levy taxes on your citizens. And secondly, a power to negotiate agreements outside of treaty, much as is the situation now under the Indian Act, where your governments will be able to tax everybody on treaty settlement land. It's anticipated that after treaty, First Nations will be able to levy property taxes on people on treaty settlement land, will be able to levy retail sales taxes, as many of the First Nations do now, and will also have a share of the income tax that's collected on treaty settlement land. Naturally, the First Nation will then have the ability to determine what it wants to do with those monies to support its government. The basic idea, and obviously this is something that many people will have to discuss and debate in the coming years, is that any additional money that the federal government or provincial government gets from any loss or change in the tax exemption will flow back to the First Nation, so that the First Nation is not out of pocket or the loser because of the changes in the tax system. The second major part of the tax chapter deals with what's called the tax treatment agreement. And essentially, these are commitments that, first of all, certain aspects of the First Nation government will not be subject to taxation at all. Certain unused lands, First Nation institutions, buildings, the wellness center at Songhees, for example, are buildings that are public institutions and will not be subject to tax. Then there will also be an agreement that will be put in place to ensure that the taxes, any taxes that do come into effect, are brought into effect in a way that protects the old tax exemption, makes sure that people aren't taxed on anything that they earned before any taxes came into effect. So, for example, any value that they have in their property, and generally ensure that the taxes are carried out in a fair way that recognizes the fact that there's a First Nation government with different interests and with protections that should be given to a government. The last part of the tax chapter will deal with, and this has not been spelled out in detail yet, how the transition from the Indian Act to the non-Indian Act will be dealt with. The tax exemption is under the Indian Act, and so one of the problems with giving up the Indian Act is that the taxation provisions in the Indian Act will no longer apply, including the tax exemption. Also, because there will no longer be reserves, and the tax exemption only applies on reserves, the tax exemption in the Indian Act could not apply anyway. So the government has agreed that there will be a tax exemption included in the tax chapter, which will provide for a transition period before taxes would be imposed. That transition period is expected to be at least 10 or 12 years, although the details of that are yet to be worked out. What's important to keep in mind when this discussion is happening is that, of course, if taxation ever does come into effect on treaty settlement land, and certainly still TTA's position that it won't, that anybody will still enjoy the ordinary tax exemptions that everybody enjoys. So, for example, low-income people typically are protected from most income taxes and get refunds with respect to GST. So those protections will still be there for everybody. It's also expected that there will be a lengthy transition period. And finally, it's expected that any taxes that are collected will flow back to the government over time. That is, to the First Nation government over time. The next chapter is the dispute resolution chapter. This is a chapter that deals with disputes between the three governments. So if a First Nation government, the federal government, the provincial government get into a dispute over something in the treaty or something that's associated with the treaty that's covered by the dispute resolution clause, then this chapter describes the process for resolving the dispute. The essential approach is that it's a staged approach where first there's a formal attempt to talk about the problem and resolve it. Then they can move on to mediation. And then if mediation doesn't work out, that is non-binding mediation doesn't work out, the parties can either move on to arbitration or to court. This is something, though, that will primarily apply to the governments and not apply to individuals within the community. But the idea is that it's designed to ensure that disputes are handled quickly, as cheaply as possible, and with the highest possibility of resolving them peacefully as possible. The next chapter is the transitional provisions chapter. And this is the chapter that deals with making sure that the world doesn't come to an end the day that treaty comes into effect. Effectively, it provides that the laws that your First Nation has in place before treaty will roll into the post-treaty period. It provides that the existing band councils become the First Nation government until the first election. It provides that any assets you have as an Indian band become the asset of the First Nation, and any debts that you have become the debts of the First Nation. So it essentially provides for a smooth transition from one regime to the next regime. The next chapter is called the implementation chapter, and this chapter deals with the whole process of making sure that the treaty gets up and running effectively. One of the biggest problems in treaty making has been lack of implementation. That is, the fact that the treaties get signed and then nobody knows how to actually get them to work. And what has been agreed upon is that a committee consisting of representatives of the three governments will be put in place. They will develop an implementation plan. There will be a budget developed associated with that implementation plan. And then they will assist the First Nations government, once it's up and running, in ensuring that all the steps are taken that are necessary to take to make sure that the First Nation government gets up and running effectively, smoothly, and in a cost-effective way after the treaty comes into effect. It cannot be emphasized enough how important the implementation process is. This will be the process that makes sure that there are not unexpected disruptions. The next chapter is the approval of the agreement in principle chapter, and I've discussed this at the beginning. And so now I'll move on to the last chapter, which is the ratification of the final agreement. As I mentioned earlier, the final agreement cannot be ratified unless there is a vote in your communities. And that vote has to succeed, and that vote actually has to result in a majority vote of the electors in your community voting in favor of the treaty. So let me just talk about the process as a whole. So it is expected that it's going to take another 2 to 4 years to negotiate the final agreement. There's a huge amount of work to be done between now and then. As we move along in that work, we'll be doing more and more communications work. We'll be reaching out to individual communities, to families, to people off reserve, and educating them about the treaty. Once we get to the point where the final agreement is ready to go for approval, The various negotiators will initial the agreement, and then it will be submitted to the different governments and communities for consideration. In the case of the First Nation communities, there will be a ratification process. That process will involve the establishment of a ratification committee. There will be a process of developing a voters' roll. There will be methods for making sure that people can join the voters' roll, even if their name didn't get added before the vote actually happens. And a vote will occur. That vote will involve all the eligible people who are enrolled, and so that is people who are eligible and have chosen to actually sign up. In order for the new treaty to be approved, a majority of the people who are eligible to vote have to vote. So that means even if 40% of the people show up and they all vote yes, that will not be enough to approve the treaty. The treaty requires a true majority vote of the community in order to be approved. Not voting is the same as voting no. Once the community has voted on the matter and has approved the agreement, then the federal government goes through its approval process and the provincial government goes through its approval process. For the AIP, or the agreement principle, that just required approval by each of the cabinets. In the case of a final agreement, the Parliament has to approve it in Ottawa, so that means there has to be a vote in the House of Commons and the Senate, and it has to be approved by the Governor-General. And in the province, the legislature has to vote in favor of it, and it has to be approved by the Lieutenant Governor. So once that has happened, and the necessary laws have been passed to give effect to the treaty, only then, after the referendum, after approval in Parliament, and after approval in the legislature, will the treaty come into effect. In fact, it's expected that likely it would be probably somewhere between 6 months and a year to actually bring the treaty into effect after all the votes have happened. So you'll be hearing a lot more from us in the coming years about this and learning a lot more about the final agreement once we get a true picture of what's going to be in that agreement. Thank you.